in the first place. And so the question you have to ask Western leaders, Western governments is, there's a phrase, there's a cliche, personnel is policy. But people dictate the nation at the end of the day. Nations are land masses, but it's the people who animate them and the values and principles that they hold that give life to them. And if you, en masse, bring in, through mass migration, people who hold values and principles that are inimical to our own, what do we expect is going to happen? And I think you're absolutely right. Look to France, look to the UK, look to other nations that have permitted mass, unchecked Islamic immigration for what is to come here. And the simple question you have to ask is, to what extent are the leaders making policies reflective of the populations, the constituencies that they represent? And to your point about
Jews who are the supremacists because they want to live in the state which is their birthright, I find it to be farcical and perverse. Which they took.
We're back in the conference. Oh my God, it was so hot. I had to change my shirt. I was soaked through. I don't know how anyone works in this kind of heat and humidity in the summer. Maybe it's a shame that air conditioning was invented, because if it was that atrocious, the politicians would never gather. Again, I think one of the big focuses of national conservatism is immigration. I mean, isn't that really one of the definitions of a country? Do you have a border? Do you have a nationality? You're not just a hotel room. Here's an excerpt from a panel on Islamic immigration, and then I have a sit down with the speaker, Ben Weingarten. So take a look at this from earlier today.
So my question to you is, why do Jews get to be the only religious group to have a state that was taken from Palestinian Muslims in the entire world? And if it is such a legitimate state, then why has it not gotten along with its neighbors like legitimate states do for the past 60 years? To the point where even America, under President Trump, tried to initiate peace, and it didn't work. And it still hasn't worked. So why? Thank you.
Well, first, I guess thank you for nominating me the unilateral speaker for Jewry worldwide. So I appreciate that. Hard to know where to begin here, except to say that Israel has been the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people since time immemorial. There's been a constant presence of Jewry there. Jews didn't seize Israel by force, as you're sort of suggesting, I think, in your question. By international law, which Eugene can speak to, Jewry has a claim to Israel, in part backed by that historical basis, as well as the fact that, of course, there's been a constant presence there. Palestinian Arabs were not forced off of the land, which was, again, by international law, sanctioned to be Israeli land. Many of them voluntarily left because the surrounding nations said, leave your homes and after we will slaughter the Jewry there. And in fact, when you talk about the hostility, I guess, of Israel towards its neighbors, Israel has been repeatedly attacked from all sides. A New Jersey-sized state for a minority population in the world, in a sea of well over 1 billion people who overwhelmingly, according to polls today, and historically has been the case, hate Jewry and wish to see it destroyed, who cannot tolerate there being, who basically want there to be a Judenrein Middle East altogether. So I think you get the question backwards, frankly, and the notion that somehow it is the Jews who are the supremacists because they want to live in the state which is their birthright, I find it to be farcical and perverse.
Which they took.
Well, that was Ben's answer. I had a sit down with him. Here's how that went. A lot of smart people here, a lot of thinkers and scholars who are trying to take their ideas into practice. It's no surprise. So we bumped into our old friend Ben Weingarten here. You might remember Ben from a dozen appearances on the Ezra Levant Show, including a very long and heartbreaking night on election 2020 when Ben stayed up into the wee hours with us on our live coverage. Ben, of course, is a writer for The Federalist and with Newsweek. Great to see you here again in person, and I'm so glad you were on a panel. Can you sum up a little bit about the case that you made to the crowd today?
Yeah, so this panel was on Israel, Islam, and the West, and I was tasked with talking about the Islamic supremacist challenge to America. And I sort of walked through what the Muslim Brotherhood in America laid out as their ultimate goal for this country 30 years ago, and then all the things America has done, in part under the influence of Brotherhood-aligned entities, individuals, and nations, to essentially help the Islamic supremacists here achieve their goals. And I concluded with the question of, when you look at the litany of policies that have ultimately seen us give up our liberties, undermine ourselves domestically and across the world, and at the very least under two administrations, the Obama-Biden administration and now the Biden-Harris administration, elevate Sunni and Shia Islamic supremacists alike, who is more responsible, or to whom do we ultimately attribute it? Is it progressives who have a worldview which believes in appeasing our adversaries, which is desirous of and has opened our borders, and which is politically ambitious and sees a growing Muslim population through immigration and otherwise, irrespective of the Jew hatred that is disproportionate among that population, the tolerance that population has, if not support for Hamas's Holocaust in a day executed on October 7th. Are we more to blame the progressives at the end of the day, or is it the Islamic supremacists who have taken advantage of our gullibility, our tolerance, our openness, our greed, our naivete? And I closed by referencing this Muslim Brotherhood memorandum from 1991, where they said that the goal here was a civilization jihadist process where they wanted to curse and sabotage America by our hands, Americans' hands, and by the hands of the believers, that is, the Muslim Brotherhood and their allies. And so I would argue that we have sabotaged our own miserable house as laid out in that memorandum, but we've had a helping hand from the believers as well.
That's very interesting. First of all, I think that's the key focus. I mean, what happens overseas, militarily, diplomatically, that's hard for, I think, most Canadians and Americans to focus on. I don't know how much difference we can make, how much of those decisions are within our hands. But so many things that are happening day to day. For example, in my city, Toronto, the pro-Hamas encampment at the University of Toronto, the weekly Hamas hate marches, the toleration of crazy calls for genocide and proximate violence, not just an abstract call for genocide, but I will kill you. The shooting of a Jewish day school in Toronto. That's much more acute to me, is the danger here in North America. The danger, I think, that comes for Jews first, but Christians very close second. Let me ask you this. How much of the rot in our institutions, like universities, can be traced to funding by Qatar and other malign actors like that? Because it's astonishing to me to see that universities that have been so synonymous with liberalism and even with Jews, Harvard, Columbia, are atrociously pro-Hamas. How did that happen?
Well, part of it is this unholy alliance, which was really the subject of my remarks, between the progressive left on the one hand and Islamic supremacists on the other. And you could almost see this personified going back to Yasser Arafat, who was Soviet-backed. I mean, he was essentially a KGB agent, and the Soviet Union felt that they could inculcate in and foment Jew hatred in the Islamic world as part and parcel of a broader project to attack the Judeo-Christian West at the end of the day. And we've had on our campuses now for decades this view. Edward Said is also another thinker here from Columbia who well represents this view, that there's this dialectical, there's the oppressor and the oppressed. And that is a narrative that is potent among the leftists who use that to justify essentially knocking America down as many pegs as necessary and elevating our worst adversaries as a matter of equity. Somehow they've come up with the perverse view that of all the oppressors in the hierarchy, it's Ashkenazi Jews who were slaughtered during the Holocaust that are the most oppressive of them all. And this plays right in, of course, to the Islamic supremacist worldview and also exploitation of the Western mind virus of leftism, which says that the West has oppressed the Muslim world, and so we're getting our just comeuppance, essentially, with jihad. And also, of course, there's the peaceful and there's the non-peaceful undermining and subverting of our societies. To your point about the institutions and specifically the colleges and what is the link, beyond the left-wing ideology that has prevailed in these schools for decades, beyond the Middle East studies departments, which have always been cauldrons of and hotbeds for genocidal jihadism, Islamic supremacism, oftentimes with funding from those nations. It's staggering if you look, and schools have not fully disclosed all of their foreign funding, and they've used ways around the disclosures that they ought to make. Of all the nations that have contributed, foreign nations that have contributed funds to American universities, really in the last 20 years, it's not China that's number one, it's Qatar. And Qatar has contributed billions of dollars, and they're not alone to our universities. They have partnerships with several universities, research and exchange programs. There's also an article that I commend everyone to read in Tablet, which talks about foreign student populations in these universities. And if you look at the quote-unquote most elite schools, you have massive percentages of foreign students in these schools, many of them from Muslim-majority countries and, in fact, sponsored by them. This is a cash cow for the universities. Foreign funding, irrespective of the nations that it comes from, and then foreign students who will pay full freight. So there's a greed aspect to this within the schools, and then there's the ideological aspect of they actually agree with the anti-Judeo-Christian Western civilizational values that are tied to the funds and the students that they're receiving.
Ben, it's insane in Canada. There are 900,000 foreign students. We're 1/10 the size of America. Imagine if there were 9 million foreign students in America. That's more. 900,000 is more than the Canadian students, and obviously they're fake. It's political. It's an immigration hack. I want to ask you one last thing. I appreciate your time. I was just in the UK on their election day, and Nigel Farage has made immigration a key issue for his newfound Reform Party. They got 4 million votes in really their first real effort, even though they only got 5 seats out of it. But you know who else also got 5 seats? Independent candidates running under the Gaza or Palestinian flag. One was Jeremy Corbyn, the hardcore left-wing former Labour leader. But the other 4 were British Muslims. I think they were all Pakistani, I'm not sure. And their campaign videos are just startling. No Union Jack, of course. The Palestinian flag, talking about Gaza, calling out, depending on the individual candidate, the way they call for genocide is more or less. These are in Muslim pockets of where the population is up to 40% Muslim. These were in seats that used to be held by the Labour Party, and the Labour Party Muslim MPs were not hardcore enough. So imagine, it's so rare that independents win. The system is not set up for that. I fear that there'll be 15 or 20 of those independent candidates next time, but more to the point that Labour will do everything it can to absorb those voters, to bring them back in the tent and win. And I see that as a prognostication for Canada 5 or 10 years from now, and for America too. I'm really worried about that, and because I don't think these newcomers from those countries, I don't think they're susceptible to debate or persuasion. I think they come over with a clan loyalty and an ideology. They don't care about, they're not going to Columbia University and listening about Marxist critiques of race or whatever. They just hate the West and hate Jews, and they can't believe they're allowed to vote people into power. I'm scared with what I saw in the UK, and I think it's coming to North America.
What you're speaking to about the newcomers in these countries is illustrated in the polls, and it also reflects the countries from which they came in the first place. And so the question you have to ask Western leaders, Western governments is, there's a phrase, there's a cliche, personnel is policy. But people dictate the nation at the end of the day. Nations are land masses, but it's the people who animate them and the values and principles that they hold that give life to them. And if you in mass bring in, through mass migration, people who hold values and principles that are inimical to our own, what do we expect is going to happen? And I think you're absolutely right. Look to France, look to the UK, look to other nations that have permitted mass, unchecked Islamic immigration for what is to come here. And the simple question you have to ask is, to what extent are the leaders making policies reflective of the populations, the constituencies that they represent? And to your point about essentially the Labour leftists in the UK, this is why I wrote my book on Ilhan Omar, American Ingrate in America. It was a clarion call to say we're going to get many more Ilhan Omars, and the party itself is going to be in hoc to this group. And as I said during my remarks today, the Muslim population in America is set to surpass the Jewish population by 2040 to make Muslims the second largest religious group in this country. And by 2050, it's expected to more than double to 8 million. If you look at what the views are of the Muslim population that is already here, disproportionately anti-Semitic, disproportionately pro-Hamas relative to the natives, look no further than the uncommitted vote in Minnesota and Michigan to see what our future looks like. And the progressives have already kowtowed to this group. They see Muslim votes as a growth industry. Muslims have typically voted 2/3 Democrats in this country. I expect the same phenomenon here. But to your last point about the counterweight here, or the sort of counter-revolutionary spirit in these countries, people know that there's something wrong with immigration. There's a reason that immigration was the #1 animating issue for the MAGA base in America in 2016. I think this is the root issue at the heart of the populist, nationalist, conservative movements writ large across the world. And at the end of the day, this is kind of the battle for our time. What kind of people do we want to be? What kind of nations do we want to have? Or are we going to sacrifice our nations?
Ben, it's great to catch up with you and hearing your predictions of 2040 and 2050. We're in Canada. We are well past that now on a proportionate basis. It's terrifying, and you can see the results on our streets. Well, there you have it, Ben Weingarten, catching up with us here at the National Conservatism Convention.